My name is Thomas, and if someone had told me 5 years ago that I would be sitting here today at 73 years old, finally free to speak my truth, I would have laughed through my tears and called them a liar. For 68 years of my life, I believed I was worthless, damned, and that even God himself had turned his back on me. But the most devastating part of my story isn't about divine rejection. It's about discovering that the very people who claimed to speak for God were the ones keeping me chained in darkness. I grew up believing that salvation came with a price tag, and that price was absolute obedience to an organization that called itself the Temple of Divine Light. You've probably never heard of them, and that's exactly how they wanted it. Hidden away in the mountains of rural Oregon, our compound housed 300 souls who had surrendered everything, their families, their money, their very identities, to follow a man we called Father Samuel. But Samuel wasn't just our spiritual leader. He was our God, our judge, and our executioner, all rolled into one terrifying package. My story begins in 1958, when I was just 8 years old. My mother, Rebecca, had been widowed the year before when my father died in a factory accident. She was 26, alone, and drowning in grief when 2 women in modest grey dresses knocked on our door in Portland. They spoke of a community where children grew up pure, where widows were cared for, where God's true word was taught without the corruption of mainstream Christianity. My mother, desperate and broken, packed our few belongings within a week. She thought she was saving us. Instead, she was delivering us into 40 years of psychological imprisonment. The compound looked like paradise at first glance: rolling green hills, vegetable gardens, children playing in carefully supervised groups. The adults moved with purpose, their faces serene, their voices soft. But even as an 8-year-old, I noticed things that made my stomach twist with unease. The way conversations stopped when certain people walked by. The way children flinched when adults raised their voices. The way my mother's eyes, which had been sad but alive, slowly became empty and distant. We lived in what they called the family quarters, long dormitory-style buildings where privacy was considered a sin and individual possessions were evidence of selfishness. Children were separated from their parents at age 5 to prevent unhealthy attachments. But since I was already 8, I was allowed to stay with my mother for 6 more months before being moved to the boys' hall. Those 6 months were the last time I would sleep peacefully for decades. Father Samuel was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. When he spoke during our mandatory evening gatherings, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. He taught us that the outside world was controlled by Satan, that our families who remained behind were lost souls heading for eternal damnation, and that only through complete submission to God's chosen vessel, himself, could we hope for salvation. Questioning his teachings wasn't just discouraged, it was evidence of demonic influence. The rules at Divine Light were countless and ever-changing. Boys couldn't speak during meals unless spoken to by an adult. Children couldn't laugh loudly because joy was meant to be internal and reverent. Books from the outside world were forbidden, as were radios, televisions, and any connection to what they called the corrupted realm beyond our gates. Even our names were changed to reflect our new spiritual identities. I became Brother Elijah, though I felt neither prophetic nor blessed. Education was strictly controlled. We learned to read using only approved religious texts, to write by copying scripture, and to do arithmetic through calculating tithes and offerings. Science was dismissed as Satan's lies, history was rewritten to support Father Samuel's interpretations, and art was limited to creating devotional materials for the community. By the time I was 12, I could recite hundreds of Bible verses from memory, but couldn't tell you what year America was founded, or name a single planet in our solar system. The punishment system at Divine Light was designed to break spirits while maintaining the appearance of righteous discipline. Minor infractions resulted in public confessions, where you had to stand before the entire community and detail your sins while others prayed for your corrupted soul. Moderate sins earned you correction sessions in a windowless room where you knelt on rice for hours while meditating on your unworthiness. But the worst punishment was complete shunning, being treated as if you didn't exist while continuing to live among 300 people who looked through you like you were already dead. I received my first taste of serious discipline when I was 14. During a particularly long sermon about the importance of absolute submission, I made the mistake of asking a question that challenged Father Samuel's interpretation of a Bible verse. The moment the words left my mouth, the entire assembly fell silent. Brother Marcus, one of Father Samuel's most devoted followers, immediately marked me for what he called a spirit of rebellion and prideful questioning. That night, I was brought before the Council of Elders, 12 men who served as Father Samuel's enforcers and interpreters of divine will. The humiliation was carefully orchestrated. They made me stand in the center of their circle while they discussed my sin as if I weren't there. They debated whether my question showed evidence of intellectual pride, whether I might be developing the kind of arrogance that led young men to challenge godly authority, whether my mother's incomplete spiritual submission was manifesting in my behavior. Finally, Father Samuel himself entered the room, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He circled me slowly, like a predator studying prey, before stopping directly in front of me. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried an undertone of menace that made my knees shake. He told me that God had revealed to him the darkness growing in my heart, that he could see the seeds of rebellion and prideful thinking taking root in my soul. Then he did something that would haunt me for the next 50 years. He placed his hand on my forehead and began to pray for my deliverance. But his touch felt wrong, invasive, like spiritual violation disguised as holy intervention. The physical punishments that followed were brutal, but secondary to the psychological warfare. For 3 months, I was assigned to the purification program, which meant 18-hour workdays in the compound's workshops, eating only bread and water, and sleeping on a wooden board instead of a mattress. But worse than the physical discomfort was the constant surveillance and the way other boys were instructed to report any signs of continued rebelliousness in my behavior. During this period, I began to understand the true genius of Father Samuel's control system. It wasn't enough to punish individuals. The punishment had to serve as a warning to everyone else, while simultaneously turning the community into a network of informants. Children learned to watch each other for signs of disloyalty. Adults competed to demonstrate their spiritual superiority by finding fault in others. Trust became impossible when anyone might betray you to gain favor with the leadership. My mother's transformation during these years was perhaps the most painful aspect of my imprisonment. The woman who had once sung lullabies and read me stories became a hollow-eyed stranger who spoke only in religious platitudes and seemed incapable of genuine human connection. She had been assigned to work in Father Samuel's personal household, which was considered a great honor, but I noticed how she flinched when his name was mentioned and how her hands shook during prayer services. Years later, I would learn that my mother's position in Father Samuel's household involved more than cooking and cleaning. But as a child, I only knew that she became increasingly distant and seemed to age decades in the span of a few years. When I tried to hug her during our weekly supervised visits, her body remained rigid, and her eyes looked through me as if she were seeing something terrible that I couldn't understand. The breaking point came when I was 16 and discovered what happened to children who pushed the boundaries too far. A boy named Michael, who was my age and had been caught questioning why we couldn't write letters to family members outside the compound, simply disappeared one morning. When we asked about him, we were told he had been relocated to a facility better equipped to handle his spiritual sickness. None of us ever saw Michael again. But rumors circulated that there were other compounds, darker places where the truly rebellious were sent to be broken completely. The fear of disappearing like Michael changed everything about how I navigated life at Divine Light. I learned to swallow my questions, to nod enthusiastically during sermons that made no sense, to smile when my soul was screaming. But the human spirit isn't designed to live in constant suppression, and by the time I turned 18, cracks were beginning to show in my carefully constructed facade of obedience. The transition from the boys' hall to the men's quarters should have felt like progress, but instead it revealed new layers of control and manipulation that I hadn't fully understood as a child. Adult men at Divine Light were divided into rigid hierarchies based on their perceived spiritual maturity and loyalty to Father Samuel. At the bottom were the seekers, new converts, and those who had fallen from grace. Above them were the servants, who had proven their dedication through years of unquestioning obedience. At the top were the elders, Father Samuel's inner circle, who wielded absolute power over the rest of us. As an 18-year-old with a history of rebellious questioning, I was placed in the lowest category despite having lived at the compound for 10 years. This meant I slept in a dormitory with 40 other men, worked the most dangerous and exhausting jobs, and was subject to constant supervision by higher-ranking members. My daily routine began at 4:30 in the morning with mandatory meditation, followed by 16 hours of physical labor, evening worship services that often lasted until midnight, and maybe 4 hours of sleep if I was lucky. The work assignments were designed to break both body and spirit. I spent months in the compound's quarry, hauling stones under the blazing Oregon sun while elders watched from the shade, commenting on how physical labor purified the soul and brought us closer to understanding Christ's suffering. During winter, I was moved to the lumber mill, where the risk of serious injury was constant and medical care was limited to prayer and basic first aid. When Brother Jonathan lost 3 fingers to a saw blade, we were told his accident was God's way of teaching him humility and that proper faith would heal him better than any outside doctor. The psychological manipulation at Divine Light was far more sophisticated than I had realized as a child. Every aspect of our existence was carefully designed to maintain dependency and prevent independent thinking. We weren't allowed to own personal possessions, which meant we had no sense of individual identity or autonomy. Our meals were communal and strictly regulated, leaving us chronically undernourished and easier to control. Sleep deprivation was constant, making it difficult to think clearly or question what we were being taught. But perhaps most insidiously, Father Samuel had created a system where salvation itself was always conditional and never secure. No matter how hard you worked, how perfectly you followed the rules, how completely you submitted, you were always just one mistake away from losing your place in God's kingdom. This constant anxiety kept everyone in a state of desperate compliance, afraid to breathe wrong for fear of eternal damnation. The sexual control at Divine Light was particularly twisted and damaging. Marriages were arranged by Father Samuel based on what he claimed were divine revelations about spiritual compatibility. Young people had no choice in their partners and were often paired with individuals decades older or younger than themselves. Physical intimacy was heavily regulated, with specific rules about when, where, and how married couples could be together. Unmarried men like myself were taught that any sexual thoughts or feelings were evidence of demonic influence that required immediate confession and punishment. I remember the humiliation of having to confess to Brother Marcus that I had experienced what they called impure dreams during the night. He made me describe these dreams in explicit detail while he took notes, supposedly to help identify the source of my spiritual corruption. Then I was assigned to sleep in a bed directly next to his for 3 months so he could monitor my sleep and wake me immediately if I showed any signs of nocturnal sinfulness. And the violation of having my most private moments scrutinized and controlled was devastating to whatever remained of my sense of personal dignity. The isolation from the outside world became more complete as I aged. As a child, I had maintained some memories of life before divine light, but by 18, those memories felt like dreams from another lifetime. We were taught that our families had either forgotten us or were actively praying for our destruction because we had chosen God over worldly attachments. Letters from the outside were forbidden, and any attempt to communicate with former family members was treated as apostasy, punishable by immediate expulsion, which we were told guaranteed eternal hellfire. My mother's deterioration accelerated during this period. The woman who had once been my anchor in the world became a ghost who couldn't meet my eyes during our increasingly rare interactions. She had developed a tremor in her hands that she tried to hide, and I noticed bruises on her arms that she claimed came from clumsiness. When I tried to ask her about her life in Father Samuel's household, she would look around nervously and change the subject. Years later, I would understand that she was living in a state of constant terror, but at the time, I interpreted her distance as rejection and felt even more isolated and unloved. The breaking point for my psychological endurance came when I was 21 and witnessed something that shattered my ability to maintain the cognitive dissonance required to survive at divine light. During a late-night work assignment in the administrative building, I accidentally walked in on Father Samuel and two of his top elders counting enormous stacks of cash while discussing real estate investments and offshore bank accounts. These were men who preached daily about the evils of material wealth and the importance of living in poverty to mirror Christ's example. What made the discovery even more devastating was overhearing Father Samuel laugh about how easy it was to control these sheep by keeping them hungry, exhausted, and afraid. He joked about the sexual favors he received from women in his household and discussed plans to expand the compound by recruiting more vulnerable families from urban areas. In that moment, I realized that everything I had believed about divine light being God's true church was a lie designed to enrich and empower a small group of men who had no genuine faith in anything except their own ability to manipulate others. The cognitive dissonance of this discovery nearly drove me to a complete mental breakdown. For 13 years, I had endured poverty, abuse, and isolation because I believed it was God's will. I had sacrificed my education, my relationships, my entire youth because I thought I was earning eternal salvation. Discovering that it was all an elaborate con game designed to benefit Father Samuel and his inner circle felt like having my soul ripped out of my body. But even with this knowledge, leaving seemed impossible. Where would I go? I had no money, no education beyond basic literacy, no connections to the outside world, and no practical skills that would help me survive in mainstream society. More terrifyingly, despite knowing intellectually that divine light was corrupt, 13 years of psychological conditioning had left me genuinely afraid that leaving might damn my soul to hell. The fear of eternal punishment was so deeply embedded in my psyche that even seeing proof of the organization's corruption couldn't immediately overcome it. Instead of planning an escape, I fell into a deep depression that manifested as complete compliance with every rule and regulation. I stopped asking questions, stopped making eye contact with authority figures, stopped engaging in any behavior that might draw attention to myself. Other members began referring to me as a model of spiritual humility, but inside I felt like I was dying slowly, one day at a time. This period of my life was characterized by a kind of living death, where I went through the motions of existence without feeling truly alive. I worked, ate, slept, and prayed according to schedule, but my spirit had retreated so far inside myself that I sometimes wondered if I was becoming the hollow shell that I saw in my mother's eyes. The only thing that kept me from complete despair was a tiny flame of anger that I carefully hid from everyone around me. Anger at being deceived, anger at losing my youth to a lie, and anger at my own powerlessness to do anything about it. The psychological damage from this period would take decades to heal, but that small flame of anger would eventually become the spark that helped me find the courage to reclaim my life. However, at 21, trapped in a system designed to break human spirits, that future seemed as impossible as reaching the moon. Before I continue with this powerful story, I want to take a moment to connect with each one of you who is listening. I know that sharing these memories isn't easy to hear, just as living through them wasn't easy to endure. But I'm telling you this because I believe that the truth, no matter how painful it may be, has the power to set us free. Not just me, but anyone who has ever felt trapped, manipulated, or convinced they had no worth. If you're finding strength in this story, if it's helping you process your own experiences, or if you simply want to be part of a community where truth matters more than comfort, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support means that stories like mine can reach people who need to hear them. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and knowing that my words are reaching people who understand makes this journey of healing feel worthwhile. The years between 21 and 30 passed in a haze of mechanical existence that I can barely distinguish from a waking nightmare. Every day blended into the next in an endless cycle of labor, worship, and psychological torment that gradually eroded whatever remained of my individual identity. But it was during this period that I began to witness events that would eventually force me to confront the true evil lurking beneath divine light's facade of spiritual purity. The first crack in my emotional numbness came when I was assigned to work in the compound's medical facility, which was little more than a storage room with basic supplies and a cot for patients too sick to work. The position was considered a privilege, given only to members who had demonstrated complete loyalty and discretion. What I discovered there would haunt me for decades and ultimately provide the final push I needed to escape the hell that had consumed my entire adult life. Brother William, the man who supervised the medical facility, was one of Father Samuel's most trusted confidants and had been at Divine Light since its founding in the early 1940s. He was a thin, nervous man with pale eyes who spoke in whispers and seemed to jump at his own shadow. Initially, I assumed his skittishness was simply the result of deep spiritual sensitivity, but I gradually realized he was carrying the weight of terrible secrets that were slowly destroying his sanity. My job involved organizing medical supplies, cleaning equipment, and assisting with basic treatments for work-related injuries. But I also served as a record keeper, documenting every person who came through the facility and maintaining detailed files on their conditions and treatments. It was through these records that I began to notice disturbing patterns that the leadership was working desperately to hide from the general population. The first pattern I noticed was the unusually high number of women who came to the medical facility with injuries that were inconsistent with their assigned work duties. Kitchen workers with broken ribs, seamstresses with dislocated shoulders, gardeners with facial bruises that couldn't be explained by outdoor labor. When I asked Brother William about these injuries, he would look around nervously and mumble something about clumsiness or spiritual attacks that manifested as physical harm. But the pattern that truly opened my eyes was the documentation of what Brother William euphemistically called spiritual counseling sessions that took place in Father Samuel's private quarters. These sessions always involved young women between the ages of 16 and 25, always lasted several hours, and always resulted in the women needing medical attention for what were described as emotional distress and spiritual purification side effects. The reality of what was happening became unavoidably clear when a 16-year-old girl named Sarah was brought to the medical facility in the middle of the night, barely conscious and bleeding. Brother William was visibly shaking as he treated her injuries, and when he thought I wasn't listening, I heard him muttering prayers for forgiveness and mercy. Sarah spent 3 days in the facility, during which she spoke to no one, and stared at the ceiling with empty eyes that reminded me painfully of my mother's expression. When Sarah returned to the general population, she was a different person. The bright, curious girl who had asked thoughtful questions during Bible study became a silent shadow who moved through her daily routine like a sleepwalker. She had been assigned to work directly in Father Samuel's household, which we were told was a great honor, reflecting her spiritual maturity. But I could see the truth in her eyes. She had been broken in a way that might never heal. Over the following months, I witnessed this same transformation in dozens of young women. They would be called for special spiritual counseling with Father Samuel, and they would return hollow-eyed and fundamentally changed. Some became completely withdrawn and rarely spoke above a whisper. Others developed nervous habits like compulsive hand-washing or hair-pulling. A few simply disappeared entirely, transferred to what we were told were other divine light facilities that could better address their spiritual needs. The most devastating case was a 17-year-old named Rachel, who had been my friend during our childhood years in the compound. She was one of the few people who remembered me from before my own spiritual breaking, and she would sometimes smile at me in a way that reminded me I had once been capable of human connection. When Rachel was selected for Father Samuel's special attention, I felt physically sick with the knowledge of what awaited her. Rachel fought back. Unlike the other girls, she refused to participate in the fiction that her abuse was spiritual counseling. She began speaking openly about what Father Samuel had done to her, demanding that the elders take action against him, threatening to expose the truth to outside authorities. Her courage was inspiring and terrifying because I knew it would not be tolerated. The response was swift and brutal. Rachel was declared to be under demonic influence and subjected to an exorcism ritual that lasted 3 days and nights. During this time, she was denied food and water while multiple elders took turns praying over her, shouting at the demons they claimed were possessing her, and demanding that she confess to seducing Father Samuel through her own lustful thoughts. I was assigned to monitor Rachel during parts of this ritual, and what I witnessed was torture disguised as spiritual warfare. She was forced to remain kneeling for hours while elders screamed at her about her supposed sins. When she collapsed from exhaustion, they would drag her back to her knees and continue their assault. By the second day, she was hallucinating from dehydration and exhaustion, rambling about demons and begging for forgiveness for sins she had never committed. On the third night of Rachel's exorcism, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life forever. I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy another innocent person to protect Father Samuel's crimes. While the elders were taking a break from their spiritual warfare, I snuck into the room where Rachel was being held and gave her water from a cup I had hidden in my jacket. She looked at me with eyes that were barely conscious and whispered something that I will never forget. "They're killing my soul, Thomas. Don't let them kill yours too." Those words hit me like a physical blow because I realized that was exactly what they had been doing to all of us for years. Systematically murdering our souls while convincing us that the death was spiritual purification. My act of compassion toward Rachel was discovered within hours. Brother Marcus, who had always been suspicious of my spiritual sincerity, had been watching me closely and saw me enter the room. I was immediately brought before the Council of Elders and accused of interfering with God's work and showing sympathy for demonic influence. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation designed to break whatever remained of my spirit. For 6 hours, 12 men took turns explaining how my actions had revealed the depth of my spiritual corruption, how my sympathy for Rachel proved that I was also under demonic influence, how my entire life at Divine Light had been a facade hiding my true nature as an agent of Satan. Father Samuel himself presided over the final portion of my trial, and his performance was terrifyingly effective. He spoke with tears in his eyes about how much it grieved him to see a young man he had watched grow up reveal himself to be spiritually lost. He talked about the years of prayer and effort that had been invested in my salvation, all wasted because of my choice to align myself with demonic forces. But then he offered me a path to redemption that was almost more terrifying than punishment would have been. If I was willing to undergo complete spiritual rehabilitation, to submit myself entirely to the wisdom of the elders, to spend the next year in isolation and prayer while my soul was purified, then perhaps God might still have mercy on me. The rehabilitation program was psychological torture designed to completely break down my sense of self and rebuild me as a perfectly compliant follower. I was placed in solitary confinement in a basement room barely large enough for a bed and a bucket. My only human contact was daily visits from elders who would spend hours explaining my spiritual defects and demanding that I confess to sins I had never committed. Food was provided irregularly and in quantities that left me constantly hungry. Sleep was interrupted by random visits at all hours of the night when elders would drag me from bed to continue my spiritual education. I was forbidden to speak unless directly questioned, and any response that showed independent thought was met with extended lectures about the pride and rebellion that were corrupting my soul. The worst part of the rehabilitation was the way it was designed to make me complicit in my own destruction. I was required to write daily confessions detailing my spiritual failures and expressing gratitude for the correction I was receiving. I had to memorize long passages about the importance of absolute submission and recite them perfectly whenever demanded. Most devastatingly, I was forced to write letters denouncing Rachel and expressing support for the exorcism that had broken her mind. After 6 months of this treatment, something inside me finally snapped completely. Not in the way the elders intended, toward complete submission, but toward a kind of desperate clarity about the impossible situation I was trapped in. I realized that I could continue this existence indefinitely, becoming more broken and compliant with each passing year, or I could find a way to escape, even if it killed me. The decision to escape wasn't brave or heroic. It was the decision of a drowning man who finally stops trying to swim and either sinks or finds something to grab onto. I had reached a point where the fear of leaving divine light was finally overwhelmed by the certainty that staying would result in the complete death of everything that made me human. Planning an escape from divine light required months of careful preparation and an almost superhuman ability to maintain the facade of broken compliance while secretly rebuilding my will to live. The rehabilitation program had taught me valuable lessons about deception and survival, though not the ones the elders intended. I learned to make my face a mask that showed only what others wanted to see, while keeping my true thoughts buried so deep that sometimes I wondered if they still existed. The opportunity came during my assignment to the compound's waste management system, a job considered so degrading that it was reserved for the most spiritually compromised members. Every Tuesday and Friday, I was responsible for driving a truck to the nearby town of Millbrook to dispose of refuse at the public dump. These trips were supervised by Brother Marcus, but his arrogance and assumption of my complete brokenness led him to become increasingly careless about monitoring my movements. The town of Millbrook was like visiting another planet after spending 17 years isolated at divine light. Cars, television antennas, children wearing bright clothing, women with short hair, men laughing loudly without fear of punishment. Everything about normal society seemed foreign and overwhelming, but it also sparked something I had thought was dead forever: hope. These people lived without constant surveillance, without fear of spiritual punishment for every minor transgression. without the crushing weight of absolute submission to human authority disguised as divine will. During my third supervised trip to Millbrook, I managed to speak briefly with a woman named Helen who worked at the dump. She was probably 50 years old with graying hair and kind eyes that reminded me of my mother before divine light destroyed her spirit. When I mentioned that I was from the compound in the mountains, her expression immediately changed to one of concern and suspicion. Helen told me that people in Millbrook had been worried about divine light for years. Families had lost contact with relatives who joined the group, and there were persistent rumors about abuse and financial exploitation. She said that if I ever needed help getting away from the compound, there were people in town who would assist me without asking questions. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was the first time in my adult life that someone had offered me help without expecting submission or payment in return. Over the following weeks, I began making small preparations for an escape attempt that felt both urgent and impossible. I started hiding tiny portions of food from my meager meals, wrapping them in cloth and storing them in a hiding place I had discovered behind a loose board in my dormitory. I began paying closer attention to the compound's security procedures, noting when guards changed shifts and which areas were least monitored during different times of day. Most importantly, I started preparing myself psychologically for life outside divine light by trying to remember who I had been before 17 years of systematic brainwashing. This was perhaps the most difficult part of escape planning, because I genuinely couldn't remember having independent thoughts, personal preferences, or individual goals. Divine light had been so successful at erasing my identity that I felt like I was trying to escape into complete emptiness rather than toward any kind of meaningful existence. The catalyst for my actual escape came when I learned what had happened to Rachel after her exorcism. Brother William, whose mental state had been deteriorating rapidly, came to me one night in a state of near complete breakdown. He confessed that Rachel had been transferred to what he called the Dark Facility, a compound in Montana where members who couldn't be rehabilitated were sent to live in conditions that amounted to psychological torture until they either achieved complete compliance or died from the stress. Brother William described the Dark Facility as a place where failed Divine Light members were kept in solitary confinement, fed starvation rations, and subjected to constant psychological abuse designed to break them completely. He said that in 15 years of sending people there, he had never seen anyone return, and he suspected that many of them simply died from the brutal conditions. The knowledge that Rachel, who had shown courage I could never match, was being slowly murdered in that place, filled me with a rage that burned through 17 years of learned helplessness. That night, I made my final preparations for escape. I gathered my hidden food supplies, stole a jacket from the laundry that would provide better protection against the October mountain weather, and wrote a letter to my mother that I planned to leave behind. The letter was simple and heartbreaking to write. I'm sorry I couldn't save you too. Maybe someday we'll both be free. I hid the letter under her pillow during the night shift when I was assigned to clean the women's quarters. My escape attempt began during the early morning hours when I was assigned to collect garbage from around the compound before the Tuesday dump run. Instead of returning to the dormitory after completing my rounds, I hid in the back of the garbage truck and waited for Brother Marcus to begin our journey to Millbrook. The plan was simple. When we stopped at the dump, I would slip away while he was distracted and find Helen or someone else who could help me reach safety. The 40-minute drive to Millbrook was the longest of my life. Every bump in the road felt like it might dislodge me from my hiding place, and I was terrified that Brother Marcus would discover me before we reached town. But even more frightening was the growing realization that I was voluntarily leaving the only world I had known as an adult to venture into complete uncertainty with no money, no connections, and no practical skills for survival. When we arrived at the dump, I waited until Brother Marcus was engaged in conversation with the facility manager before slipping out of the truck and hiding behind a pile of discarded appliances. My heart was beating so violently that I thought it might give away my location, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely control my movements. This was the point of no return. Within minutes, Brother Marcus would discover my absence, and the full weight of Divine Light's security apparatus would be mobilized to find me. Helen was working her usual shift, and when I approached her, she immediately understood what was happening. Without asking for explanations or details, she told me to follow her to a small office building where she made a phone call to someone she simply referred to as Tom. Within 20 minutes, a pickup truck arrived driven by a man who looked like he might be Helen's husband or brother. Tom was a quiet man in his 60s who asked me only one question: "Do you want to go back there?" When I shook my head, he nodded and said, "Then we'll make sure you don't have to." He drove me to a safe house run by a network of people who specialized in helping individuals escape from religious cults. I learned later that this network had been monitoring Divine Light for years and had successfully helped dozens of former members rebuild their lives. The safe house was a small farmhouse about 2 hours from Millbrook, run by a former social worker named Patricia, who had dedicated her retirement to cult recovery work. Patricia understood immediately that I would need months of careful deprogramming before I could function independently in mainstream society. She explained that people who had lived in high-control groups often experienced severe psychological trauma when suddenly exposed to normal social freedom and decision-making responsibilities. The first weeks of freedom were simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Simple decisions like what to eat for breakfast or what time to go to bed became overwhelming when I realized that no one was going to punish me for making the wrong choice. I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that Divine Light security teams were coming to drag me back to the compound, and it took months before I could sleep through the night without anxiety attacks. Patricia helped me understand that my fear and confusion were normal responses to leaving a cult environment. She explained that Divine Light had used classic brainwashing techniques to create learned helplessness and dependency, and that rebuilding my ability to think independently would be a gradual process requiring patience and professional support. She connected me with a therapist who specialized in religious trauma and helped me begin the long journey of understanding how my mind had been systematically manipulated. The process of deprogramming was like learning to walk again after spending years in paralysis. I had to relearn basic social skills, develop personal preferences, and figure out how to make decisions without constantly seeking approval from authority figures. Even choosing clothes to wear was initially overwhelming because I had no sense of personal style or individual taste after 17 years of mandated uniformity. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was confronting the full extent of the abuse I had witnessed and experienced at Divine Light. In the cult environment, I had learned to rationalize and minimize trauma as necessary spiritual discipline. But in therapy, I began to understand that what had happened to me and others was criminal abuse disguised as religious practice. The anger that emerged during this realization was so intense that I sometimes felt like it might consume me entirely. Learning about the outside world was like discovering that I had been living in a cave my entire adult life. Technology, politics, popular culture, social norms, everything had continued evolving while I was frozen in the artificial environment of Divine Light. I spent hours in libraries reading newspapers and magazines from the past 2 decades, trying to understand the world I was now free to inhabit. But perhaps the most profound challenge was developing a sense of personal identity separate from the role I had played at Divine Light. For 17 years, I had been Brother Elijah, a spiritual seeker working towards salvation through submission and service. Now I needed to figure out who Thomas actually was beneath all the conditioning and control. This process of self-discovery was both exciting and terrifying because it meant acknowledging that I was starting my real life at 30 years old. The guilt about leaving my mother behind was almost unbearable during those first months of freedom. I knew that my escape would result in severe punishment for her, and the knowledge that she was suffering because of my choice to seek freedom created constant emotional anguish. Patricia helped me understand that staying to protect her would have meant sacrificing myself without actually improving her situation. But the rational understanding didn't eliminate the emotional pain of abandoning someone I loved. The transition from survival to actually living took nearly 15 years, and I'm not sure I would have made it without the extraordinary support system that emerged around me during those crucial early years of freedom. Patricia connected me with other cult survivors who became my first real friends as an adult, people who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding an identity after decades of systematic psychological control. Through their stories and shared experiences, I began to understand that my journey, while uniquely painful, was part of a larger pattern of recovery that thousands of people had successfully navigated. My first job in the outside world was working as a janitor at a small manufacturing plant, a position that Patricia helped me secure through her network of employers who were willing to hire people with unconventional backgrounds. The work was physically demanding, but psychologically liberating because it gave me structure and purpose without the constant threat of spiritual punishment. For the first time in my adult life, I was earning money that belonged to me, making decisions about how to spend my time, and interacting with co-workers who treated me as an equal rather than a spiritual subordinate. The learning curve was steep and often humiliating. I had to figure out how to open a bank account, use public transportation, shop for groceries, and navigate dozens of other basic life skills that most people master during adolescence. My co-workers were generally patient with my ignorance about popular culture and current events, though I could see them exchanging glances when I asked questions that revealed the depth of my isolation from normal society. One of my co-workers, a man named Jerry, who was about my age, took particular interest in helping me adjust to life outside the compound. Jerry had served in the military and understood something about institutional conditioning, though he could never fully grasp the psychological complexity of cult programming. He invited me to his house for dinner, introduced me to his family, and gradually helped me understand how normal relationships functioned between people who weren't competing for spiritual approval or living in fear of authority figures. Through Jerry's friendship, I began to experience genuine human connection for the first time since childhood. His wife, Maria, was a warm, funny woman who treated me like a slightly eccentric brother rather than a damaged refugee from a religious cult. Their children, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, were fascinated by my stories about life without television or video games, and their innocent questions helped me process my own experiences by explaining them to someone who had never known anything but freedom. The healing process was neither linear nor predictable. Some days I felt strong and optimistic about my future, grateful for every small freedom and excited about possibilities I was just beginning to imagine. Other days, I would be overwhelmed by depression, anxiety, and a profound sense of loss for the years that had been stolen from me. The nightmares about divine light continued for years, and I often woke up convinced that my escape had been a dream, and I was still trapped in that basement room undergoing spiritual rehabilitation. Therapy became the cornerstone of my recovery, but it took time to find a counselor who truly understood the complexity of religious trauma. My first therapist, while well-meaning, seemed to view my experiences as simply an extreme form of childhood abuse, rather than understanding the sophisticated psychological programming that had kept me compliant for 17 years. It wasn't until I found Dr. Sarah Martinez, who specialized in cult recovery, that I began making real progress toward mental health. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my symptoms, Hypervigilance, difficulty with decision-making, chronic anxiety, problems with trust and intimacy were normal responses to prolonged psychological trauma. She explained that cult survivors often struggle with what she called frozen development, where emotional and social growth stops at the age when the programming begins. In my case, I was essentially an 8-year-old in a 30-year-old's body, trying to navigate adult relationships and responsibilities with the emotional tools of a child. The process of education became another crucial element of my recovery. With Patricia's help, I enrolled in night classes to earn my high school equivalency diploma, studying subjects I had never been allowed to learn at Divine Light. Biology, chemistry, world history, literature. Each new area of knowledge felt like a revelation that expanded my understanding of reality beyond the narrow confines of Father Samuel's teachings. Reading became my passion and refuge during those difficult years of adjustment. I devoured books about science, philosophy, psychology, and history with the hunger of someone who had been intellectually starved for decades. Each book helped me understand how much of the world I'd been denied access to, but also gave me tools for critical thinking that made it impossible for anyone to manipulate my beliefs so completely ever again. The question of spirituality and faith was perhaps the most complex aspect of my recovery. After years of having religion used as a weapon against me, I initially rejected any form of spiritual practice or belief. But gradually, I began to distinguish between the authentic human need for meaning and connection that draws people to religion and the exploitation of that need by manipulative leaders like Father Samuel. I eventually found peace in a small Unitarian Universalist congregation where questions were welcomed rather than punished, and where individual spiritual exploration was encouraged rather than controlled. 5 years after my escape, I received devastating news through the network of former Divine Light members that Patricia had connected me with. My mother had died at the compound, officially from pneumonia, but actually from what amounted to neglect and abuse that had worn down her immune system and will to live. She was 53 years old. The news hit me like a physical blow, bringing up all the guilt I had been working through in therapy about leaving her behind. But along with the news of my mother's death came information that helped me understand the broader impact of my escape. 3 other members had successfully fled Divine Light in the years following my departure, and they credited my story with giving them hope that escape was possible. One of them was Brother William, the broken man who had supervised the medical facility and whose confession about Rachel had catalyzed my own escape attempt. Learning that my choice to seek freedom had inspired others to save themselves helped me process the grief about my mother and gave meaning to the terrible price we had all paid for our liberation. The investigation into Divine Light began 8 years after my escape, when a former member named Jennifer came forward with detailed documentation of the financial fraud and sexual abuse that had been systematically covered up for decades. Jennifer had been one of Father Samuel's victims as a teenager, but unlike many others, she had managed to maintain enough psychological resistance to secretly document the crimes being committed against her and other young women. I was contacted by federal investigators who were building a case against Father Samuel and his inner circle. Testifying about my experiences at Divine Light was one of the most difficult things I had ever done, but also one of the most important. For the first time in my life, I had the opportunity to speak truth to power without fear of punishment, to give voice to the suffering I had witnessed, and to seek justice for people like Rachel who could no longer speak for themselves. The trial received significant media attention, which brought dozens of other former members forward with their own stories of abuse and exploitation. The evidence against Father Samuel was overwhelming. Financial fraud totaling millions of dollars, sexual abuse of minors, forced labor, medical neglect, and psychological torture. He was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to life in prison, where he died 3 years later. Several of his top lieutenants also received substantial prison sentences. But perhaps more importantly than the legal justice was the validation that the trial provided for survivors like myself. For decades, we had been told that we were mentally ill, spiritually corrupted, or simply lying about our experiences at divine light. Having our stories believed by judges, juries, and the general public was profoundly healing and helped many survivors move forward with their recovery. The years following the trial marked a new phase of my life, focused on helping other cult survivors navigate their own journeys toward freedom and healing. I became involved with organizations that provided support services for people leaving high-control religious groups, and I discovered that sharing my story could be a powerful tool for both education and recovery. Speaking at conferences, writing articles, and mentoring individual survivors gave me a sense of purpose that transformed my trauma into something meaningful. At 45, I met Linda, a woman who had survived her own experiences with religious abuse in a fundamentalist Christian sect. Our relationship was built on mutual understanding of trauma and a shared commitment to honest communication about our triggers, boundaries, and healing processes. Linda taught me that love could exist without control, that intimacy was possible without domination, and that two damaged people could help each other become whole rather than using their wounds to inflict further damage. We married 3 years later in a small ceremony attended by our chosen family of fellow survivors, supportive friends, and the few biological relatives who had maintained contact with us despite our unconventional backgrounds. The ceremony itself was a powerful statement about our freedom to define our own values, relationships, and spiritual practices without interference from authoritarian religious leaders. Today, at 73, I can honestly say that my life has been worth living despite the decades of suffering that marked its beginning. The compound in Oregon where I spent my youth has been converted into a retreat center for survivors of religious trauma, a transformation that feels like the ultimate victory of healing over harm. The relationships I have built, the knowledge I have gained, the contribution I have made to helping others, all of this represents a triumph over the forces that tried to destroy my humanity. The most profound lesson I have learned is that it is never too late to reclaim your life, to discover who you really are beneath the conditioning and control, to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear. Every person reading this story has within them the strength to break free from whatever forces are keeping them trapped, whether those forces are religious, familial, social, or internal. If you are currently trapped in a situation that feels hopeless, please know that escape is possible and that there are people ready to help you when you are ready to accept that help. If you are struggling with the aftermath of abuse or control, understand that healing is a long process, but that genuine recovery is achievable with proper support and determination. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult but necessary story. If it has touched your heart, challenged your thinking, or given you hope for your own journey, please subscribe to this channel and share it with others who might need to hear these words. But more importantly, I want to invite you to share your own stories in the comments below. Whether you are still struggling, in the middle of recovery, or on the other side of trauma, your voice matters and your experience has value. Together, we can create a community where truth is honored, healing is supported, and no one has to face their darkest moments alone. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.